a little bit of shuffling. Happily, we have Peter Stoudemire who will be joining us today. And Peter is an expert in all things far right and fascist, amongst other things. So Peter will also be doing the capitalism session tomorrow a bit with myself. So we're happy that he's able to join us. I hope you had a refreshing time in the wilderness of I think outside Milwaukee somewhere.
Wisconsin.
Where?
Northern Wisconsin.
Northern Wisconsin, excellent.
Yep.
We might have a couple people from Milwaukee actually with us. So we've got Peter who teaches history at Marquette University and has been a faculty member at the ISE for a very long time. I think Peter today will be talking a little bit about a slim volume he wrote in the 90s with Janet Biel on eco-fascism. Subtitle is Lessons from the German Experience, which was really, and still to this day, is one of the few resources in English on the fascist incarnation of ecology that took place in National Socialism, but also on the kind of broader trajectory of romantic blood and soil ideologies that overlapped largely with ecological thinking. So we've been talking a little bit the past few days about epistemology. So here's a nice historical background to that. Saladin Ahmed is a close affiliate and colleague and comrade of the ISE, who's been writing a series of fantastic essays for our blog. The first one was actually on, well, maybe not the first, but the first I remember recently was on COVID-19, capitalism and nation states. If you haven't checked it out yet, it's a fantastic rumination on how capitalism and the nation state both enabled these crises and have been unable to adequately answer them. And then more recently, a great text called When We Lose the Ability to Be Shocked, Fascism Has Already Arrived, or something like that, pretty close, which is a nice comparison between the rise of neo-fascist authoritarian populism in Turkey, Brazil, the United States, and which one am I forgetting, Sal? Brazil?
India.
India, thank you. I just woke up. It's 7 in the morning out west. So yes, I'm looking forward to a great conversation. I think and then I'll probably also make a couple comments briefly on some of my work on eco-fascism, which is kind of focusing more on contemporary trends, building very much on some of the work Peter's done in the past. And then we can have a conversation about all of these topics. The theme, which it's really sad because this was Haya's panel idea, frankly. She's been very concerned and thinking about the question of what this age of crisis and unreason means for a politics of direct democracy, and specifically the rise of post-truth and just outright lies on the right. But I think we could also expand that and say the rise of kind of various irrationalities more generally, some of which I think Sal will also be talking about today, some of these kind of cultural factors that actually span left and right in some regard. And that's also something I'll focus a little bit on, so how contemporary right ecology, some of these trends overlap many of our same critical emphases. So what does that say about our critique? How do we distinguish it from that of the right? So how do we avoid these strange bedfellows? Okay. And also, I think, during the conversation, we'll have plenty of time to get at some of the great questions we've already been exploring and people have brought up. Some of the ones yesterday that came from, concerns or questions about a politics of direct democracy in, the context of social rationalities like racism, sexism, homophobia. What does this mean in an era of decentralized neoliberal capitalism? People had really great questions and comments. So I think these inputs can also be kind of a framing and a segue to discuss those very important questions. So I think, Peter, are you cool with kicking us off?
Sure.
And then I think, and then we'll hand things over to Sal. So I think we could do it however we want, but maybe would you all rather do input questions or take all the questions at the end?
Whichever.
maybe we can have a brief pause just for some clarifying questions, but then maybe save the more substantive ones for some kind of back and forth, try to find some common points. Cool. Okay. Well, thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll turn things over to Peter Stoudemire. And feel free, please, to introduce yourselves further, or whatever I missed out.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Is the audio good? More or less? Welcome. I'm sorry that I have not been able to participate at all so far. I think I missed Katie and Mason yesterday, for example, which I should have seen and would have loved to see. I missed Dan and Haya. I'm sorry that Haya is not here. I'm sorry that Pinar is not here. I don't think I know her. I don't think I've met her, but she has this amazing essay out there on the web. I think it's called "Humans Are Not the Virus." I believe it's about ecofascism. So I was kind of hoping that I'd be able to, that we could interact. Her stuff is great. So look it up if you have a chance. And I'm also sorry that, yes, thank you. Blair just posted the link to that essay. I just read that sometime last week. I pride myself. I'm trying to stay more or less up to date on contemporary discussions of ecofascism. And in the last year or so, that has become a challenge because there's a lot of stuff out there, some of it not so good, some of it really good. So Pinar's essay, I think, is an example of that. I'm also sorry that you're gonna see, we're asking you all to see me, I guess me and Blair, both this morning and then for a really long time tomorrow afternoon, but tomorrow's on a different topic. So I will try to keep things lively for right now. Also, Blair and I just agreed about 15 minutes ago that I would lead us off this morning. So I'm not as prepared as I usually am. But what I thought I might do to set the basis for our larger discussion is just give some background on the concept of ecofascism, where it came from, the very, very different meanings that different people attach to it, what social ecologists tend to mean by it, the ways that the critical ways that we use that term and that notion, and then maybe use that as a launching pad into some of those broader discussions of democracy in an age of crisis and unreason, which is the title of our panel. So social ecologists did not invent the term ecofascism, although a lot of us did play a fairly significant role in popularizing that term in the 1990s and then onwards. Over the last 25 years or so, the book that Blair mentioned, which I don't think I have a copy of to show off to you in the other room right now. That book came out in 1995, so 25 years ago now. Janet Beale was the major driving force behind the book. I contributed the first of the two essays in it, but she's really the one who got the project going, and she wrote the second half of the book. I am right now writing, right now, what I was doing before Blair and I agreed that I would come on this morning. I'm writing a new essay about current 2019, 2018, 2020, current far-right conceptions of ecology that should probably appear next year with a little bit of luck. So it's very much an ongoing topic. It has not stayed the same in the 25 years since we sort of launched this term into, or helped launch this term into critical discussion. But we did not invent the term. The term ecofascism had already been circulating among social ecologists. Murray Bookchin used the term repeatedly as a critical analytical term for years before some of us put it into print. And in fact, it had been circulating in Europe. It had been circulating at least since the latter half of the 1970s. I know that there are examples in French and in German from roughly 1977, 78, 79. It's possible that people used the term before that, and I just haven't come across it yet. So it's a term that had been around for a while. And those uses in the 70s, by the way, they used the term ecofascism. Those were left ecologists in the French and in the German contexts, left ecological activists using the term ecofascism to describe specifically right-wing versions of ecological politics or far-right versions of ecological politics. And that is the way that social ecologists use the term as well. And it's important to clarify that because like any term, once it's out in the world, it takes on a life of its own. The people who invent the term or the people who popularize the term, for better or worse, don't have any authority over what it ends up meaning in public discussion. So for a lot of people today, I have noticed a lot of people use the term very loosely, sometimes so loosely that all it really means is ecofascism is essentially, well, it's okay to be into ecological stuff, but don't take it too far. Don't get carried away, because that'll bring you into ecofascism, which is not at all what social ecologists mean by it. And very importantly, there are people on the right, the anti-environmentalist portion of the right, which is a very, very strong component in right-wing thought. There are people on the right who use the term ecofascism as an attempt to discredit all ecological activists. They think we're the ecofascists, is maybe the simple way to put that. So what social ecologists are trying to get the term to mean in public discussion, and what a lot of other radical left ecologically involved people are trying to pin to that term, is a much more specific set of meanings. What we mean by it is maybe easier to unpack if you take the term ecofascism and flip it around. And if you instead think about the term fascist ecology, instead of ecofascism, think of it as fascist ecology. And that way, maybe that term makes it a little easier to see that what we're talking about is a specific version of ecological politics, or several different interrelated bundled versions of ecological politics that are themselves intertwined with fascist politics. That's what social ecologists mean when we talk about ecofascism. So it's a specific set of both historical traditions. A lot of my own research as a historian goes, goes back to the late 19th century and then tries to draw, tries to draw some of those strands forward, but also very, very much a contemporary bundle of issues, a way that right-wingers, and especially far right-wingers, or the radical right, as we sometimes call it, the ways that those folks have appropriated a set of environmental concerns and given their own spin to it. And what I would point out there, what I think is very significant, is that it would be a mistake for those of us on the left, for those of us on the radical left, like myself. It's tempting to think that the radical right is just exploiting environmental issues in a sort of opportunistic way, because environmental issues now, by now, they're unavoidable. Every political organization of any kind has to take some sort of stance on the ecological challenges of our time. And it would be nice to think, it would be a comforting notion to think that when the far right adopts ecological rhetoric, it's really just a cover for what they actually want to say. I think that's a mistake. At least for several important chunks of the far right, they are, for better or worse, they are genuinely committed to what they see as an ecological politics. And that's the challenge for those of us who have an emancipatory ecological vision. The challenge is to try to figure out, what are those guys talking about? What do they mean when they refer to the land, when they refer to nature, when they refer to purity, and so on and so forth. So that's just a little bit in the way of background for where the term came from and where it might or might not be going in the contemporary scene. As far as details about what sorts of fascism, what sorts of far-right instantiations of ecology we have in mind, that's a very, very, very mixed bag. My own work focuses specifically on German instances of it, in part because there's so many of them. There's in the German political history and in German cultural traditions, it's just not hard to find a lot of those strands that link together discourses of nature and the natural world with discourses of the nation, usually ethnically conceived conceptions of the nation. That's extremely common, but that's just my own research. There are people right now who are doing some fascinating research on Russian instances of these phenomena. I don't read Russian, so I only get, when those things get translated into a language that I read, then I can try to learn a little bit about them. There's work going on right now about some of those themes in the Baltic states, in Hungary, in Japan. It's really interesting work. I don't read Japanese either, but there's really interesting work about reactionary ecology in Japanese contexts, in South Africa, in Rhodesia, back when there was a Rhodesia. It's the kind of thing that you can trace virtually all the way around the world for virtually the last give or take, the last 100 years or so, for the past century. The periods where those things became especially prominent were during the period in which fascist regimes actually ruled important chunks of the planet, especially in the 1920s, 1930s, and the first half of the 1940s. There's not as much of a discernible eco-fascist strand in Italian fascism. It's there, but it's much more muted. I would say it's much more minor. It's much more pronounced in Nazism. Parts of Nazi Germany, there's contrary strains within Nazism as well. But under both Mussolini and especially under Hitler, that was one of the relatively few occasions so far, one of the relatively few occasions historically where those sorts of ideas have actually had an opportunity to implement themselves as a part of government policy. So that's why a lot of the focus on a lot of the discussions today, they often seem to return back to the 1930s. And by the way, the same thing is true on today's radical right. Those folks go back, and a lot of folks on the radical right today, all over the world, in North America, in Europe, and lots of other places, those folks go back and look at the people that I write about critically from 1930s Germany, for example, the people that I would identify as genuine eco-fascists. The radical right today goes back and looks at them as their forefathers and foremothers, as their predecessors. Some of those folks today want to proudly reclaim what they see as the noble legacy of a green variant of fascism. So that makes it especially important, again, I think, for those of us on the radical left who want to understand this phenomenon. We have to see that these aren't just historical issues. These aren't just things that were defeated in 1945 and then magically went away. They didn't go away at all. They are absolutely still there. The last thing I would say, I don't want to take up too much time here because I want to leave lots and lots of time for discussion. But the last thing I would say is a more general point about not just the ecological strands within fascist and radical right thought, but a more general point about how phenomena like fascism cyclically arise in the first place. Whatever stances those political movements might take on ecological questions, why is it that fascism is the sort of thing that keeps recurring, that keeps coming back again and again and again? For some of you who have been around for a while, some of you have been around longer than I have, and I'm kind of an old guy, so that's saying something. But for those of you who've been around for several decades now, you have all lived through repeated cycles where it looked like, for a time, it looked like fascist ideas, fascist proposals, fascist political styles, it looked like they had been pushed totally to the margins of, so to speak, respectable political discourse, and then somehow they managed to sneak back in, often through the back door. But in the last 4 or 5 years, it's been increasingly right through the front door in lots and lots of different places in the United States, where I live, and lots of places around the world. And that's deeply disturbing for those of us who have who are committed to an anti-fascist politics. And it raises a question that I think we would do well to ponder for a while. And that question is, where does fascism even come from in the first place? There was a prevalent theory for a long time, especially among liberals, especially among people who themselves had no truck with fascism, liberals who considered themselves the real anti-fascists. They weren't radical leftists, they were liberals, but nonetheless, they fully rejected fascism. And a lot of those liberal thinkers for a very long time, some of them still today, they held this sort of reassuring theory of fascism that basically said that it was an aberration. It was kind of it was an exception to the supposed norm. Sure, it erupted in interwar Europe and it took power in 2 countries, Italy and Germany, forgetting about the dozens of other fascist movements in all of the other countries that never quite became regimes, but were very powerful for a time. Sure, it took power for, a decade or 2, but look, we destroyed it. We crushed it. It took a war. Millions of people had to die, but we finally brought the complete end to fascism. That might be a comforting notion. The problem is that it's absolutely false. Fascism is not, unfortunately, an exception. It is not, unfortunately, an aberration. To my mind, fascism is built into the kinds of societies that characterize so much of the modern era. I'm not going to say all societies, but certainly in the Western world, certainly in the global North, the kinds of societies that have come to be the norm. To make it a little too simple, societies structured around capitalism and the state. I would also add in things like patriarchy and white supremacy and other forms of racial hierarchy, but in general, societies whose basic pillars are capitalism and the nation state. It's precisely those kinds of societies that continually generate the sorts of social dislocation, social crisis, social discontent on which fascist movements feed. And it is naive of us to think that as long as those systems are still the prevailing way of the world, as they still are in 2020, as long as those systems are still in place, it's going to be the kind of thing that will keep, fascism is going to be the kind of thing that will keep creeping back up on us. And in other words, fascism, to use a term that I'm sure you've all heard a bunch of the last couple of days, fascism, in my view, is a dialectical phenomenon. And I do not mean that in a positive sense. I just mean it to show that it's not something that appears in isolation. Instead, it appears as a supposed challenge to the problems that capitalism and the state continually reproduce. When patriarchal societies can't offer the men that they promise all of these great benefits to, when it can't actually deliver, when patriarchy says one thing and actually does something different, when white supremacy offers its white folks all of these benefits and then fails to actually follow up and deliver for a very large chunk of the population. When capitalism says it's going to bring prosperity for all, when the state says, we've got this figured out, we know how to run a society, don't worry, the cops will take care of it, the courts will take care of it. When those social systems say they're going to run things and figure things out and give benefits to you and you and you and you and you, but not you. When those systems then manifestly fail to do what they themselves have been promising everyone that they would do for years on end, that's when people start to get discontented, not necessarily for the best reasons. Sometimes people get discontented and drift into fascism because they're angry, sometimes legitimately, sometimes illegitimately, because they're discontented, but sometimes it's because they feel like they got the short end of the stick. They feel like that they, as men or as white people or as whatever, that they deserve something, they were promised something, and then they didn't actually get it, which is true. They didn't actually get it. That's one of the things that can lead people to drift into a far-right form of opposition against the prevailing status quo. And that's what I want us to keep in mind. I'm going to shut up for now. I'll try to say a little bit more about this in tomorrow's discussion of alternatives to capitalism, because it's a really important thing to keep in mind. We are not the only critics of capitalism out there. I will probably say that exact same phrase 27 hours from now, but it's a really important notion for us to keep in mind. Fascists presented themselves, many fascists, not all of them, but many fascists then as now present themselves as the supposed real critics of capitalism, as the genuine or authentic opponents of capitalism. And they're not just saying that. A lot of them actually deeply and genuinely believe it. And it's incumbent on us to try to figure out, what does that mean for a radical politics, an emancipatory politics, a liberatory politics today. That's all I have for now. I'm hoping we can have a broader discussion of unreason, irrationalism, democracy in an age of crisis, et cetera, et cetera. I will mute myself for now. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. I just wanted to put it out there before we move on to Sal. If anyone has any just very brief, more clarifying questions, I ask that we hold the more substantive ones until the end on a particular term, thinker, more detailed. Anyone? Okay. Then we'll hand things over to Sal.
Okay,
Thank
you, Blair. Thank you, Blair, for the introduction. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I guess you can hear me well. A main section of my talk was going to be about fascism. But now after Peter's talk, I'm leaning more towards even focusing even more on fascism, because those are very, I think they're very good critical points that we need to discuss in general. I mean, we in the public sphere. But I want to just start from one last point you made, Peter, and then I'll go in the order of my two papers that I was trying to just give a brief summary. So just the point about fascism in the West and so on. I think actually and I would like to also hear your opinion about this. If anything, there is also a almost complete dismissal of fascism outside the West. And that is, I'm afraid it's not happening for good reasons. I think it's happening for bad reasons. It's not the reason that it is not demonization of the other. I think it's something quite disturbing as the demonization of other. And just to put it simply, I would say it is more in the scholarship in general. I mean, there are some people, of course, and I will mention a couple of names who have worked on that. But in general, there is a dismissal of fascism, say in the Middle East or in Asia or elsewhere. And I think the reason why I say it is disturbing, it is the fact that it seems the other, sometimes from the point of view of white racism, is not, it's something that cannot even be fascist, if you know what I mean. So fascism is something kind of preserved for the European, whatever, for the white race and so on, because the other is whatever is in the racist, Eurocentric discourse is irrational, weird, whatever, extreme and so on, but not fascist. And that's very interesting. Now, no, of course, there is also a lot of mentions of fascist this, fascist that, and so on. But again, we all know there is a lot of ambiguity in that use as well, and I hope I will touch on that later. But just to finish that point also, Stephen Eyring, the great, I don't know if you are familiar with him, 2014, he published a book called Ataturk in the Nazi Imagination. He proves by using, he proves by using actual historical evidence, newspapers and so on, that actually Hitler's hero and Mussolini's hero was Ataturk. And Ataturk, in fact, inspired them. And nobody else has been mentioned in Hitler's speech, one person, as much as Ataturk was. And that is, so we know Ataturk comes to power long before the Nazis come to power. Then, of course, you have the Armenian genocide. And there has been a little bit more work on that, the Armenian genocide and the Holocaust, and how the Nazis kind of were inspired by that and so on. So anyway, I'll move on, but I will start with, again, a couple of things, just general comments, and I'll try to summarize two papers, and I will not be successful for sure, but I'll do as much as possible, just basic points. One, I think that at the moment we live in, I think, and I've done this in several other articles, that there is a similarity, a lot of similarity between the moment we live in and the so-called interwar period. So between the two, between the two wars in the 20th century, and also in terms of fascism. In terms of fascism, in the sense that there was a rise, and of course that is the first historical rise of fascism, I would say, since the moment of Ataturk. But then, of course, then you have Mussolini. And with Mussolini, it was still not taken very seriously all the way in the 20s, to the degree that even people on the left, like people like Trotsky, actually didn't talk about fascism that much, even this all the way to the 20s. And there are people who like, there are all kinds of explanations for that. But one thing I think we should remember is that if there's an excuse for that people were not alert enough, they didn't do enough to stop fascism back then, there's this argument that people just didn't know. This is the first time people just didn't know what horror was in fascism and what fascism meant and because of course there are a lot of intellectuals, poets, artists also supporting this mass movement. But now we don't have that excuse. We know very well what fascism can bring. And I used to say the threat of fascism in those articles. But I think it is misleading anymore to talk about the threat of fascism. It is the reality of fascism. It is already here. We are dealing with it. The other misleading problem is, again, it is coming from academia, unfortunately, all this debate about should we call this fascist or shouldn't we call this fascist, as if it matters for the victims, as if caging children would be, less problematic if we didn't call it fascist, and we have seen this forever. And at this point, I personally think, like I'm starting to lean towards just forget about the word, but what are we going to say about this phenomenon? And the ambiguity is that of course there are people who use it as a swear word. Both right and left, and there are people who use it. They warn us. There are several books came out just in the last few years, including Jason Stanley, I think from Yale, How Fascism Works, 2018. What he does, he basically lists all the characteristics of fascism and why this is similar and so on. So my problem with that kind of liberal account of fascism is that. Again, it builds on this historical definition, even though it wants to warn us about the re-emergence of fascism. And then you have a lot of, counter arguments, very easy. People would just say, well, look, Trump is not Hitler, let's be serious. And yeah, of course, that's a very easy way to refute that. But and unless you are familiar with other, I would say, critical theory accounts of fascism, so the first generation Frankfurt School, it is easy to come up with that kind of refutation. I mean, one of those accounts, for example, Adorno wrote 2 great articles about basically applying Freud to understanding fascism and so on. One of the things, for example, he says, one of the concepts he used, the great little man. The great little man is the kind of, because if the fascist leader, if it's simply just the godlike figure, then it is difficult for the masses to relate to. So it must be the father figure, because you have the mass individual, the authoritarian personality, Adorno also called them, who is desperate for the father figure, who cannot have a good day at any point in their lives without living under the shadow of the father figure. And in fact, in my long version of the paper, I do start with family as the institution where the entire problem starts. But let's leave that now for a minute. But the good point, the strong point about that approach, I would say, once you start with family, then it is easier to see how the state is a patriarchal institution. And this is such a serious problem. Like I've been told, by political scientists, you talk about state, what else? What is the alternative? It has been so horribly, so terribly internalized and normalized that we cannot even imagine a life outside the authority of father figures, whether state or other institutions that function under. Now, Just to finish that previous point, there are some other good books recent. I would say one of them, Shane Burley, I think, from Oregon. Now, the good thing, I think he's an activist. So his work is really good. He doesn't waste time about, maybe we call it fascism, maybe not. And one of the very nice lines there is that hadn't Trump existed, maybe it is paraphrased, hadn't Trump existed, the alt-right would have invented Trump. So here we have to be very careful not to reduce the problem to Trump. We all know the problem is much longer, and we should know that fascism has always been around. It was never, as Peter was saying. So here's the other side of the problem is that, especially in times of crisis, I argue, there's this tendency to find any kind of false hope. And I would say liberalism is deeply guilty of that. I would say, of course, before liberalism, religious, so-called spiritualist movements and so on, because that's what they do. It is, feel positive and so on, believe in the universal, ultimate, absolute justice, which is what matter and so on. But especially times of crisis, there is this movement. And if you note, whether in dictatorship, under theocracy, or a liberal democracy, houses of worship, is that true? Did I say it right? Worship houses, they were considered essential services and open during this crisis. And then there is an ideological reason for that. It should be clear. That's where the decharging, that's where the recruitment happens. Now, you have nation states that are directly using both national and religious fascism. They obviously would use those tools, but you have states that are secular and liberal Democrats, and they appeal to the same kind of mass pacification and so on. So just to, I can't spend more time on fascism, but another point, just one last point on fascism on this section is if you go back to this is something even David Harvey mentions. If you go back to the 20s, you don't have that. So I mentioned that point, that you don't have a lot of work on fascism or debates on fascism. But there is this scholar, David Harvey, as I said, mentions, of course, among others, Karl Polanyi. So he wrote a book in 1944, The Great Transformation, and he ties fascism directly to the market economy. In the 20s, that crisis was not. In the 30s, the crisis start, and then you have fascism he says, as a world power. Now, there has been a lot of attack on Marxist accounts on the basis of they are reductionist. But in fact, what we have now, the liberal accounts, I would argue they are terribly reduction, much more reduction, because at least the Marxists could explain these other conditions, material conditions. The horror, the end of the story, the mass stupidity starts when we reduce all these things to simple moral positions. As if we all agree on things like love your neighbor and so on, the problem is over. No, the problem starts there. Freud was genius enough to realize that before fascism, if you go back to his lectures, if you go back to any of his main works, The Future of an Illusion on religion, or just group psychology. In group psychology, that's what Adorno used. Any of these works and his lectures later, he explains in very clear language, and he was a great writer, as we all know, that if you have any in-group, even if he literally says this, even if it's based on love, the principle of love, you're going to have, exclusionary tendencies and out-group and so on and so forth. So the problem is, it's a terrible mistake to reduce these the rise of the alt-right and the rise of extreme right and fascism to a moral problem. It's not a moral problem. It's much more complex, and definitely I suggest it is time to at least go back and read some of those Marxist critiques from the 20th century and later. Or if nothing else, just read David Harvey, A Brief History of Neoliberalism, for God's sake. I mean, that's a classic now. And he warns even then, 2005, I believe, that this is going to give rise to extreme right and violence and so on. And the book was published by Oxford, and there's no speculations. He's very careful to remind us there are no speculations. These are all numbers and so on and so forth. Okay, just to move on. Actually, I think how am I doing, Blair? Should I stop?
No, you're good.
I'm good.
Okay, we've got an hour and 15.
Okay. So just to move on. So I don't want to say more about spirituality, but if that bothered anyone, I would love to say more. I think it is, as a matter of respecting each other, I think we should be talking about these issues, especially times of crises like now. And my main argument for that is that there's a mass tendency to find the father figure, the authority of the father figure, and what Fromm called, escape of freedom, escape from that horror that comes with freedom. And that's when the times when usually fascists take power. It's an opportunity for fascists to, capitalize on those crises. Because otherwise, like, what do they need to do? They're going to invent an enemy, scare us day and night and so on. But now we are already scared. So it is easier. We are all raw materials for fascist forces. And it is not going to be stopped by simply having good tendencies. It takes something much more serious, and this is where my the other part of my work comes in. I think, excuse me. I think we are nowhere close to have that kind of social movement that is capable of facing fascism at this point. I think we better be prepared for gloomy days. The question is not when, at this point, is really what to be done about fascism, because we, as Blair mentioned in the introduction, you have Brazil, you have India, just think about India. We are talking about what, over 1 billion people now governed by a card-holding fascist regime, and it's only getting worse. And there is this game of, and so here's where I think neoliberalism again becomes extremely relevant. There's this game of like pseudo-dualism between, like here, we have us, them, whatever, the Christian, the non-Christian, the West, the East. Within India, of course, you have Hindus and Muslims and so on. And we all know, like if you go back to about 8 months ago, the demonstrations, the riots, there were all kinds of people in those movements. Also, according to the constitution in India, you cannot actually distinguish people based on their religious affiliation, perceived or actual. So, but of course, fascist movements have done that historically, like creating a pseudo-dualism, in-group, out-group, for obvious reasons, to advance their views about the world and so on. So what's the relationship between all this and the historical moment we are living in again? The first reaction we saw in all nation states was what? Closing borders. Because that's what they do. That's the only thing they've been trained to do. And now we know if the ecological crises are not obvious enough, just very recent, really one recent article says, summarized 73 other works, articles based on research, collective research. They all come down to the conclusion that about 50% of all species today are under threat and 33% are endangered. Within this century, it's possible that all insects will disappear. And insects became part of the ecological system 400 million years ago. So imagine, like, these are very, very serious. We all know, we all talk about this. But if that was not serious enough, now with this pandemic, it became very clear to my mind, and I think this is something that we should be talking more about, that nation states are incapable of actually fatal tools to deal with this kind of pandemic. And it is very clear that these kind of problems are international, are global, and you cannot have a national solution for them. So that illusion is over. The hard time is, again, to denormalize all that internalized beliefs about nationalism and nation state and us versus them and so on and so forth. And especially since the 80s, when neoliberalism basically takes over and commodifies, and this is the last main point I'll make, commodifies identities and divides the world based on identities, and we end up fetishizing perceived identities, including, cultures, religions, and so on and so forth. So what neoliberalism in that sense did, and there is a hint of this in Harvey's work also, but more so you find more of that in Zizek. I think he did a great job on that, but don't expect anything systematic. Of course, it's still Zizek. But what he did, he goes back to a very important point made both by Gramsci and Benjamin about the culturalization of politics. But of course, we could also add, and he does add sometimes, the politicization of culture. He maybe doesn't put it that way. So culturalization of politics in the sense that we basically forgot how we used to see the world when at least Marxist was alive enough to have grand views about the world, about the macro picture. That when simple things, simple issues, simple approach, that when you have violence, it is possible, maybe it is worth looking at life conditions, at poverty, material conditions, and so on. Now, that was called reductionism. What do we do now? Nothing. When there is war, in Yemen there is war, why? What is our explanation? Usually the neoliberal view is, whether directly or indirectly, we have different cultures. There's cultural relativism, as if there are people in the world who just love violence and diseases and viruses. And then you have the Europeans and white North Americans who hate viruses and violence and poverty. They love fun and beaches and magazines and I don't know what, you get my point. I'm being sarcastic. Please get the point. It's very dangerous to quote me like that directly. Okay, so I'll stop here. Hopefully later I'll finish a couple of other points during the discussion. Thank you very much. Sorry for speaking too much.
Thanks, Sal. That was great. A lot to chew on and to ponder. I'll try to keep my comments somewhat brief. First, I want to just add a couple comments on contemporary ecofascism. I'm very happy to hear, Peter, that you're working on a piece on that. I had my own piece come out on this topic this past year called Alt-Right Ecology, Contemporary Right-Wing Environmentalism and Eco-Fascism in the United States, which actually came about thanks to a recommendation on the part of Peter. But I want to discuss some of the trends on the far right and how they overlap with those of the left, and try to think about these in the context of this broader eclipse of reason and what this means for directly democratic politics. So a couple of comments on contemporary far-right environmentalism, and then some more about social ecology, direct democracy in an age of unreason. Do these trends undermine at all the viability of this political orientation? So as Peter, I think, mentioned, I think the first thing that's important to notice about the alt-right in general, and a lot of the contemporary right in general, but also, eco-fascist wings in particular, is that they're notably not a defense of the status quo as traditional conservatism often presents itself, but rather often a critique of it, and especially the further you get into the kind of esoteric ecological wings, a revolutionary critique of it. This has kind of disrupted a lot of people's understandings, as Sal was saying, making it more difficult for people to categorize some of these actors, because a lot of what they're saying can sound a lot like what we're saying. So it's not surprising then that liberals would lump us together the same way that it's interesting right now in the current uprising against white supremacy, that, the only way people have made sense of militant demonstrations is it's either got to be far right extremists or far left extremists, Antifa or Boogaloo Boys. So it's interesting to keep tabs on how the center polices both reactions. So anyway, there's a surprising degree of discursive overlap with the left in general, but also with social ecology in particular, as you get into some of these far-right ecological groups. Anti-statism, decentralism, anti-capitalism, ecology, and various forms of communitarianism, not all of which are racist, which I think is another thing that Sal's talk has prefaced. How do we think about fascism outside of what is especially a very pervasive North American understanding of fascism in general and racism in particular as basically boiling down to a black-white color line? What does that mean in India? What does that mean in Turkey, where we're dealing with non-white groups? I think that's a really important blind spot in our theoretical understandings of both racism and fascism. And Peter also mentioned it's important to note that it's not simple co-optation of left ideas, but these are sincere beliefs by many of them. They're confronting the same social crises, but they're offering a radically different analysis. They have different motivations and different solutions. So what are a few elements of this social critique? First, I want to put this out there because I think it also overlaps with some of our epistemological questions. People have been having some questions about dialectics, about spirituality. Well, I want to say that a lot of the kind of like philosophical foundations of these groups and these ideologies is a reactionary anti-modernist one. They understand modernity as decadent, as corrupt, as overly mediated and complicated, as urban, and thus failing and wrong and in need of collapse. So it overlaps a lot with the kind of declinist narratives of people like Oswald Spengler, Julius Evola, which Peter's written extensively about, basically, fall of Western civilization up to the fall of the white race, white genocide, etc. Who is responsible? In many of these narratives, of course, it's Jews, leftists, other subaltern groups. We can talk a little bit about this as well later, the resurgence of anti-Semitism. I shared a special journal issue that some of us had some essays in recently that's especially looking at anti-Semitism from a left perspective, but also on the left, and looking as well at like how the kind of hegemony of critical whiteness theory in the last 40 years has kind of blinded us to this very important form of racism that doesn't map onto the color line either. So a lot of these groups are united by belief in palingenesis, the idea that because of this decadent, corrupt modernity, we need a violent rebirth that cleanses its corruption. Of course, this is also very much targeting like urban life and who lives in urban spaces. This is the highest concentrations of non-whites. In the past, they've been associated with Jews, et cetera, et cetera. In these same anti-modernist reactionary circles, it's a very interesting melange of ideas. So of course, I mentioned some of the older ones, but some of the newer ones draw on some of Bookchin's old debate partners. For example, John Zerzan has been popping up increasingly in far-right and far-right ecological discourse. John Zerzan was the anarcho-primitivist author who was allegedly the ideological mastermind behind the Eugene anarchist Black Bloc in the 90s. And Murray Bookchin had a series of debates with him that were very much building on the themes of his debates with deep ecology, that essentially, if you follow the logical conclusion of these ideas, they are in fact eco-fascist. And it's interesting that, probably without reading Bookchin, although I will say, Peter, you're mentioned very often in these right-wingers' writings, that they're definitely reading your book as a resource. I know that probably doesn't warm your heart, but it is interesting to see that social ecologists are kind of the go-to experts on sometimes their own history. But in any case, people like the Russian neo-fascist Alexander Dugin are reading Zerzin. He's being discussed on the Stormfront boards, which is like the main, white supremacist board. So I want to say also this is primarily a romantic discourse that appeals to a better past, to an authentic or real life, and to common sense notions of the right way of life. It often, invokes a pastoral, unmediated, slower lifestyle that valorizes emotion over reason and nature over the artifice of society. So it's worth noting that a lot of these same sources and themes you can also find on the left, and especially the ecological left. So of course, historically, this has been a reaction to industrialism, to capitalism, to the rationalization of nature, to urbanism, and the repression of civilization, to get to Freud. So there's a lot of area here for overlap. So and specifically, there's a lot of openings to ecological discourse. So the other component that's really notable in the resurgence of right-wing ecology is that they have very much rediscovered and embraced the eco-fascist tradition that Peter's written about, which again is not surprising that they're reading and mentioning Peter. So this means the green wing of the Nazi party that Peter spoke about. They're really interested in this character named Savitri Devi, who is a French, English, Greek Nazi who basically combined Nazism with veganism and deep ecology and Hinduism, who was a spy for the Axis, who was leafleting after the fall of the Third Reich to, keep the fight going, was imprisoned for their beliefs. She's been rediscovered by especially the ecological alt-right and lionized, and Greg Johnson, who's the main guy behind Countercurrents, one of the main alt-right media empires, is a huge fan, wants to do a book on her. Pentti Linkola, the Finnish deep ecologist and kind of advocate of racist immigration policies, who recently died. He's a very big figure in this. You can see a lot on the Pine Tree Twitter when you see the little trees next to the names. This, well, it can obviously mean anything, but in some circles, that Pine Tree Twitter is a euphemism for basically ecofascism. And all of these ideas are coming together in a variety of contemporary groups. For example, many people are probably familiar with Atomwaffen Division, probably the most violent and scary contemporary far-right group that have been involved in several murders. Their kind of trinity that they often online are advocating is Dylan Roof, McVeigh, and Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, who is also kind of a hero to, again, some of the deep ecological and green anarchist wings of these movements, of actually not their movements, but other movements. They're also interested in Charles Manson's ecological racialism. He's kind of been taken up as like a symbolic, fellow traveler. It's worth noting that not only did he have a swastika carved into his forehead, but he also was associated with the slogan of ATWA, which it's an acronym ATWA, which stands for Air, Trees, Water, Animals, or All the Way Alive. So we can see him as kind of a figure that's in this esoteric eco-fascist milieu. Another group, which has been described as the ecological wing of the alt-right, are the Wolves of Finland. They're primarily in the Northwest and the Southeast. They describe themselves as a tribalist gang. They're very much esoteric and ecological in their orientation. They glorify violence and fighting and male bonding against what they call the empire of nothing, which, they rail against the empty life of consumerism. We need to go back to a simpler way of life, of martial bonding. Interestingly as well, this group is led primarily by a gay quote unquote androphiliac named Jack Donovan, who's this heavily muscled, macho guy. So it's interesting, there's like these openings, and also to different forms of sexuality on the one hand, but also going back to some of the gay wing of the Nazi party, which Peter could also mention. So these groups, they're united by a critique of science, reason, modernity. They celebrate myth, intuition, pagan European roots, and sometimes, but not exclusively, race. For these groups and actors, nature represents a timeless hierarchical order and the alternative to a modernity whose multiculturalism, feminism, wealth, urbanism, and statist bureaucracy all breed decadence, weakness, and inferiority, just an inferior way of life. We need to get rid of all this. So I just mentioned the race component, and that's another thing that I think is interesting, and that's shifted in recent years on the far right. Of course, you still have plenty of white nationalists and overt neo-Nazis, but you also have increasingly a move instead towards communitarianism, identity politics, bioregionalism, discourses which in many cases reject overt white supremacy in favor of what they call ethno-pluralism or identitarianism. We've probably all come across this, well, if this group can have, if you can have black nationalism, why can't you have white nationalism? If they can be separate, why can't we be separate? If they have a culture, we have a culture. So it's articulated in terms of this right to difference, of diversity, of separatism. And of course, for some groups, this is merely PR, and they are in fact committed racialists and racists, but for many, they genuinely seem to believe it. They just think that distinct groups should stay in their lanes and communities. And I think here it's especially worth noting that there is some real overlap with contemporary left discourse on this question. Side by side with this, also troubling this nexus of race, fascism, ecology, is the growth of the multiracial ultranationalist organization, the Proud Boys. I would say that they're definitely a fascist group, but they're also a fascist group that have some very prominent people of color members. So how do we think about this? In fact, just here recently, locally, we had a Black Lives Matter rally, the first one that was here. And two armed men came to troll us in a giant truck that was emblazoned with custom Trump paint jobs. And they came out with bulletproof vests and assault rifles, and one of them was black. And this is also becoming increasingly common where, there's a few token folks of color to insulate from the charge of racism. So I just want to say that fascism is not exclusively or only about the color line, either historically or now, and that a lot of these groups advocate instead a diversity of distinct nationalisms. And just briefly on another kind of point of discursive overlap, increasingly a lot of these groups are also taking up the language of indigenism and decolonization, especially in Europe and outside of North America, but even here too. And why is that? Well, because on the one hand, it sets up this kind of internal us versus an external them narrative. It provides a kind of prelapsarian narrative of the unity of a people before some fall, however we understand that. It can very easily become a Volkish politics based on blood and soil, of people tied to an area. And we've seen this, especially here in the Northwest with right-wing bioregionalism. Of course, where I live from Northern California to Southern BC is often called Cascadia. One of the most prominent groups in the Unite the Right rally a few years back was called True Cascadia. And here's basically a group that's trying to co-opt the language and the imagery of this idea of a Cascadian bioregion and saying, well, this is already a mostly white area. Let's make this the white ethno-state, which has been the Northwest Territorial Imperative is what they call it. And that's been a very prominent discourse for at least 30 years or so. In fact, one of the guys who kind of was most responsible for advocating it, I'm forgetting his name. He lived in Bremerton, my hometown, and he just died this past year. Peter, do you recall his name? It'll come to me. In any case, back to this decolonization discourse. So we're seeing this increasingly in Europe and Russia, Africa, and the Middle East, where post-colonial arguments are being used to reject the quote unquote imperialism of Western concepts like feminism, gay rights, and democracy. So I'll give one example of, these are usually right-wing, communitarian and religious groups that are making these arguments, but you can actually find similar arguments in a book that's all across decolonial reading lists, and that's Horia Boutelja, French indigenous author who her last book was called The Whites, the Jews, and Us, which is openly anti-Semitic, which is soft Islamist, has a variety of other really problematic components. And just in terms of the actual expression of this, one, we can see this character named Casey Corcoran, who was a green anarchist, very involved with green anarchist circles in the Northwest, who after debates about Antifa and anti-fascism and basically policing the boundaries of the ecology and anarchist movements became a European indigenist instead. He started going back to look at his European roots, his Celtic roots, et cetera, et cetera. And another one being Vince Reinhardt, who's a Tlingit tribal member and a bioregionalist. He's an editor at this kind of third positionist group called Attack the System, which is basically, Attack the System is headed by a guy named Keith Preston, who is a former, he was a former founding member of the Love and Rage Revolutionary Anarchist Federation, which some ISC people were members of or involved with, who then, kind of came, increasingly right. He now identifies as kind of a pan-tribalist who wants to unite the left and right against empire and against, the New World Order and the empire of nothingness, et cetera, et cetera. So Casey Corcoran and Vince Reinhardt are both in this kind of like left-right overlap discourse. They often make ecological arguments. And Vince has said that specifically that, we already have tribes as Native Americans. You guys should organize tribes. You should find your indigenous roots, and we can unite and overthrow this system. And in fact, it's interesting, the Malheur occupation that happened in Oregon, there was like 2 out of the, I think, 13 people were Native Americans. It's very interesting overlap increasingly happening. So this, for me, this also poses an important question. This term BIPOC is getting used a lot. Black, Indigenous, people of color. There's a very rich conversation happening right now in Europe about as many ideas that are generated in the American Academy and then filter around the world, and then they confront social contexts that aren't always so, where they don't make quite as much sense, and this is one of them, because what does it mean to talk about being indigenous in Germany, for example? This discourse is already there, and the people that are using it are the far right and Nazis. We're saying, well, we're the indigenous Germans, we have a right to control and police our own culture, our own lands. We don't want these foreigners, these immigrants, these refugees coming and bringing in these ideas, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's been kind of unreflexively been taken on by parts of the anti-racist left there, and other parts of the anti-racist left are saying, hold the phone. What does this mean? What do we necessarily want to celebrate indigeneity, which I think poses some very interesting and important questions for us as North American leftists, given the kind of left-right overlap I already mentioned, as well as these more deeper philosophical questions. So I guess just to kind of conclude, with these generalized social crises and the erosion of traditional categories of left and right that's increasingly happened in the last 40 years, we're seeing a blend of anti-statist, anti-capitalist, and ecological forms of ethno-nationalist communitarianism. So what does this mean for all these forms of irrationality? What does this mean for a politics of direct democracy? And here I just want to end with some questions for us to discuss as we go forward. First, how do we distinguish our utopian vision from that of the far right? How can we distinguish our vision of decentralist and anti-statist politics? And how do we fight the appeal of a hierarchical organic society, a place for everyone and everyone in their place, which is a vision very close to that of feudalism, which I noticed was a topic of conversation in the chat box. And I think it's worth looking at that appeal, not just on the left and the right, because one of my criticisms of an otherwise very interesting book that Sal mentioned, Polanyi's The Great Transformation, is that my doctoral advisor, Nancy Fraser, a socialist feminist author, has criticized Polanyi for basically saying that, yes, capitalism unleashes this dislocation. Market society unravels the fabric of social life in many, many ways. And Polanyi argues this creates a double movement. First, it undermines, and then there's a social reaction to it, that people resist having their lives undermined. But the problem here is that the resistance takes a lot of different forms, and it's embedded in a lot of different things that check markets, which Peter will talk about tomorrow. One of the things that historically has checked markets is patriarchy. So not all things that check markets or serve as like, arguments for anti-capitalism, another arguments, to check the growth of capitalism are necessarily progressive or emancipatory. Other ones can be religious ones. There's a lot of religious critiques of the rise of capitalism. So I think here, this gets at this deeper issue of how we frame our critiques and our alternative visions. Is our idea that we want to go back to this, supposedly better and pure world before the rise of capitalism and the nation state, or is our utopian society the one that exists in front of us that's never existed before? How do we orient towards questions of modernism and identity and cosmopolitanism, freedom of movement? These are all really important questions. So just last on this particular topic in question, given that we live in this very irrational world, what does this mean for the politics of direct democracy? Conversely, this poses the immediate question, what then is the alternative to democracy? Does it rest on separatism, on minority veto power, on consensus? How would these mechanisms be enforced? I think one answer that we've already heard in the last couple of days, and you hear a lot around the ISE, is that every revolutionary project is an educational one. And to this, I would say yes, but I think many will find this an unconvincing answer. Do we then wait for perfect consciousness before we have a democratic politics? We fight for this? To me, I think that needs to be fleshed out much more seriously. Okay, and I'll end there. Sorry that went on longer than expected. So now we can open up the floor to discussion. And if there's another ISC person or symbiosis person who wants to moderate, that might be great, since I might also be doing double duty.
I can try. I will have to switch to my computer, so maybe take like 1 or 2 first stack while I do that.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Katie.
Blair, can you take those first?
Sorry, I didn't realize you were in the process of getting on. So 16 and then Joseph.
Yeah, thanks all for all the explanation. It's really enlightening. I have a question about direct democracy and the risk of fascism, or at least how that can get how that can become really a problem. When I study groups that are asking for direct democracy, organizing popular assemblies, that are not previously militant, or that don't have any cadre or don't have any political education before, and basically whose demand are, we want power and we want that people decide and not the representative. I mean, some people often come up with the thing of saying, well, what if we would, the decision of the Popular Assembly would be to exclude all migrants? And like a lot of people will say, well, then it's better to be on that assembly to try to fight and convince and to use rational debates and stuff. And the way theoretically I wrap my head around that is that, well, for me, direct democracy is not direct democracy if it excludes people from deciding, and when their let's say future is affected by that, namely, well, if migrants are excluded, they are not part of that decision and they will be impacted by it. But how, like on the ground, seeing that demand of direct democracy comes from people that don't explicitly have anti-fascist politics, I just want to know, like, what are people's view on that, and how do they reconcile it, or what are their like analysis and framework that they keep in mind? Because sometimes I just have like, well, it's this demand of direct democracy, we want back control on our own lives, but that can also lead to that. I mean, it's the same demand that we have and that they have. So yeah, I don't know if it was clear, but.
Why don't we take a few, I think, Joseph, and then Laura.
I was just going to ask, oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, whose turn is it?
Joseph and then Laura, and then Lily.
Joseph first, okay.
I just have a quick question. For the people who talked about ecofascism, I have an interest in the kind of the historical to contemporary debates about group selection and evolutionary biology associated with people like Konrad Lorenz and Ronald Fisher and these sorts of people. I'm just wondering if the people who work on ecofascism can talk about any connections they've made with ideas of group selection and evolutionary biology.
Should we take one more and then we can turn it over to you guys? Laura?
Yeah, hi. So I was wondering about what Peter brought up about ecofascism being so widespread in so many different cultures, that he mentioned there are Russian, Hungarian, Japanese variations of it. I have also noticed in my research about this subject that it was less influential in Italy than it was in German fascism. So I was wondering if, he could elaborate a little bit on why that was. And also, I'm wondering if, he mentioned that it goes back 400 years. And I'm wondering if we can get some more information on pre-Darwinist ecofascism, because from my research, it really seems like it was very rooted in Darwinism, but yet I feel that there were some of those ideas circulating before that, just from the colonial period. So that would be 400 years ago. So I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little more on those points, or if anybody else has any thoughts about that.
So Blair, Sal, Peter, I'm not sure who wants to take which, but.
When there is a chance, I would love to talk about a variation of what 16 was saying. And it's something I just wanted also to mention as part of my talk. When there is...
Please go. That's great.
Oh, okay, good. Okay, I'm not sure if this is exactly related to what you were saying, 16, but I have the same worry in terms of what is so intrinsic in direct democracy or any form of democracy that would negate or prevent forms of fascism. And the perfect example I think of in terms of that kind of the problem, when groups come together and, on principle of whatever autonomy, localism and whatnot. The worry is actually even more, I would say. That kind of, small group, let's, on whatever principle, and, whether New Ageism or not, or some, but if it is about just the tools of whatever, communicating our opinions and so on. I mean, this is one of the things made Foucault call Rousseau like the totalitarian, something like that. I don't know, I forgot that. He used a very funny expression about how Rousseau was the guardian of totalitarianism and so on. Why? Because Rousseau was talking about like complete transparency in the name of the general will and so on. Okay, but what I want to mention is my reading of, very quick, a couple of lines, my reading of Midsummer, that's 2019, the movie, the horror movie. And if anything, that movie tells me, any group, no matter, and you remember the scenes, all wearing these, nice clothes and so on, green views, and in Sweden and all that, and a bunch of graduate students going from the US and so on. Then you realize the horror. But of course, the sexism and misery is clear right from the beginning. But if the viewer is not sensitive enough to any of that, then you realize that is hell. That is absolute hell and horror, and all in name of let's come together. We hate the technology and the machine and the city and so on. So I think, if anything, really, that's why it is. I mean, it's a very legitimate question. We should be even more worried in terms of groups that look whatever, friendly towards whatever nature, history, tribe, culture, whatever, and come up with some supposedly alternative form, but have no clue about, say, other worries in terms of both world politics, but also like historical grand questions and so on. So I won't say more about that, but you get the idea, like Midsummer, how that is an example of all the horrors that come out from a group.
Peter, would you like to, Blair was suggesting that on both the current question that Sal just took from 16, which she re-summarized in the chat as how do we ensure that direct democracy is not used for exclusionary purposes under the guise of it's the people who decided, it's the result of direct democracy. And then Laura's question about pre-social Darwinist forms of ecofascism and the manifestation of ecofascism in, wow, the chat keeps popping, sorry.
In Italy and Germany.
Cultures. So if you could comment on both of those, that'd be awesome.
Sure. Thanks, Katie, for taking over, by the way. My answer to 16's question, which is an awesome question, my answer isn't especially reassuring. My answer is basically direct democracy in that sense is a tool. It's a format. It's a procedure. It happens to be one that I am deeply committed to, that I've spent my adult life trying to work through. But that's really all it is. It doesn't tell us anything about content. You could use a directly democratic procedure to organize a genocide of your neighboring community, and it could be fully directly democratic. It could fit all of the criteria that we demand and expect from a directly democratic assembly or what have you. Now, I do not mean that answer as a kind of I don't think that should be a depressing answer. I just think it's good for us to be realistic and clear-eyed about what directly democratic frameworks can and cannot bring. So from a social ecology point of view, you absolutely need those frameworks, or at least I think. I think most social ecologists agree that those are requirements. They are essential, but they're not the whole deal. You also have to add in all of those other elements of a broader critique of hierarchy and domination. If you don't have that broader critique, and if you ask me, we need to go way beyond the vagueness of hierarchy and domination, but that's a different question. If you don't have those other elements, you are unfortunately leaving yourselves open. You're leaving your beautiful, nice, well-honed, directly democratic procedures and practices, you're leaving them wide open for appropriation by other folks who do not share the critique of domination and hierarchy, who, quite the contrary, are looking for better, newer, more modern ways to institute and implement forms of domination and hierarchy. So that would be my possibly much too theoretical answer to that. I have a lot of practical responses based on my own experience in co-ops and collectives over the years, but we'll hold those for now. Laura's question is great. I have to give a very, very, very condensed version of an answer for right now. To clarify one misunderstanding, I did not mean to say that I think this history can be traced back 4 centuries. If I said that, that was my fault for it being too early in the morning. What I meant to say was that some of my own research goes back a century or so. Actually goes back a century and a half. I study into the latter half of the 19th century. Right. I don't really follow things back that much further, but now that you've raised the question, it shouldn't be that hard for us to trace pre-Darwinian forms of similar thinking. The original Romantic movement, wherever you're locating it, in Germany and Britain and the US, et cetera, that's before Darwin. That's before Darwin publishes stuff and gets famous and changes the world. There's a lot of similarities there. So I think you shouldn't need a social Darwinist component. For that matter, social Darwinists didn't really need Darwin. Darwin himself was not a social Darwinist. The social Darwinists took some phrases and concepts from Darwin, turned them on their head, and then ran with them. Unfortunately, that's normal in history. That's how political life works. The reason why there's that contrast between Italian fascism and German National Socialism, which is what the Nazis called themselves, that's a tough one, but the simple version I would say is that Italian fascism was never as fully committed and obsessed with race the way that Nazism was. Nazism was obsessed with race from the very, very, very beginning, from long before they took power. Italian fascism was all over the map. Italian fascism didn't turn openly racist until 2 things happened in the middle of the 1930s. They expanded their colonial empire in Africa, which accentuated the anti-Black versions of racism. And then in 1938, they turned to an openly anti-Semitic policy. But that's 1938. Mussolini came to power in 1922. So Italian versions of fascism were shiftier than that on those questions. And in Italy, the modernizing variants within the fascist movement usually had the upper hand. Not always. There were some green variations there, the people that I study. But in Italian fascism, they were very small minorities. In Nazism, the Green factions were never a majority. That would be that would also be a historical mistake. They were always always outnumbered, so to speak, by the full-on militarist, industrializing, and modernizing faction of the Nazis. But the Green factions were a substantial minority, and I think that is important. The Green factions under Nazism had control over several pretty important policy areas, which they simply never had in Italy. Their counterparts in Italy were sometimes important ideologues. Blair mentioned one, Julius Evola, good example of that, but he was an oddball even among the Italian fascists. When he tried to join the fascist party, they wouldn't let him. They refused to allow Evola to join the party. Whereas some of the folks in the Green Wing of the Nazi Party held extremely high positions. Several of you have heard of famous Nazis who you may not know, but were strongly supportive of some of those environmental issues. I have to apologize before I stop talking. My internet, like Brian's, has dropped out several times. I missed about a third of what Blair said before, which I feel badly about. But if somebody wants to catch up with me after this and I didn't get to address something, please feel free to email me outside of the forum here. Thanks.
Thank you. I think, well, so were there any other comments from the panelists, or should we move on and take the next set of questions?
Just one on the evolutionary biology question. I forgot the person who asked that, and I know Peter would have lots to say on this. I mean, one is the visibility of Kevin MacDonald as the main kind of academic anti-Semite who explicitly frames Judaism as a group evolutionary strategy. So he gives a very, scientific cast to anti-Semitism, to a classic anti-Semitic trope, and he's like a main figure in alt-right discourse. I think this brings up an interesting related question that's already been discussed with the pre-Darwinistic forms of eco-fascism and fascism, and this is that these ideas are open to both modernist, highly racialized interpretations, as well as pre-modern, more romantic ones. And I think it's worth being attuned to both, as they're both still around. I shared this quote by Joseph de Maistre, the classic arch-conservative and romantic critic of the French Revolution, that the modern right begins as a critique of universalism and a defense of particularism, of nationalism. So we're seeing that come back to the fore, and I think this should, again, trouble some of the ways we think about community and identity on our own. A lot of people, post-rise the alt-right, have said that the right has successfully co-opted the language of the left, especially identity politics. I would counter that it's actually the other way around, that the left took on various components of a right-wing cosmology, and now the left, or the right is, wait, did I say that right? The left has taken those on, and the right is now taking them back, as this quote illustrates. So I think this is something that's worth thinking about. And on a deeper level, I mean, if we want to put this into a more philosophical register, I mean, there's Sal already mentioned Adorno, and Adorno had this series of critiques of Heidegger, and Heidegger's category of being, and his assertion of identity as a fixed category, which then led to Adorno. The title of his book was called The Jargon of Authenticity, because if you're focused on being and identity as, and this is not in terms of contemporary concepts, but more thinking about it more abstractly, if you're thinking about A equals A, it's a static thing, as opposed to the kind of dialectics we've been talking about, which focuses on becoming, then there's always going to be a policing of authenticity. Who is the authentic representative of this particular group? And I think one of the really exciting lessons that's being learned in the current moment of the uprising against George Floyd. I don't know how many people saw this fantastic New York Times op-ed by Keeanga Yamada Taylor, a Black female socialist who teaches, I think, history at Yale, but it's called The End of Black Politics, and is making a point that I think, especially like African-American critical theorists like Adolph Reed have made for a very long time, that this often points both towards, there's hidden essentialisms there, and second, it sets you up for a representational politics of who's going to speak for the group. And the problem is, the last 40 years, we've seen the rise of a Black political leadership class and a Black business class who have consistently, shunted these more radical demands for racial and economic justice into, reasserting their own class position. So Reed has been screaming himself blue in the face for 40 years, saying that this is not just a politics of race, it's a politics of class. And now more mainstream thinkers like Yamada Taylor seem to be recognizing this insight. So that's what I find is very exciting about the current moment, is that they're making materialist demands we are making materialist demands for defunding the police, which then bring the secondary question, what do we want to spend this money on? Social services, instead of using, the violent coercive arm of the state to solve everything. So that's a very fantastic thing. And then, as I've mentioned, I think only in breakout groups to now, it's very exciting to see this play out at the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone or organized protests now, where you literally have general assemblies that are debating this question. Okay, we want to defund and disarm the police. What are we going to do with this money? And to top it off, it's being often facilitated by Duwamish tribal elder, while there's Duwamish dancers like around the side, just to give it this amazing decolonial vibe. So anyway, I think this is a really promising time for thinking beyond some of these overly reified categories of communities and interests to get at like the political questions and the material questions that are underneath them via direct democracy.
Thank you. I think next we had Lily and then Max, and then Stack is open if other people want to request to be on deck in the chat.
Yeah, hi. Okay, so it's actually me and Lily in the same car, and I'm the one with the question.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Anyway. My question is in some case directed at Saladin, but I would be interested what anyone has to say about it. This is about the kind of like religion as the site of like the promotion of fascism, which I definitely agree with. And on the flip side, I guess I'm wondering about this kind of like stance on religion and spirituality in general. I recognize that we've talked in the last couple of days a lot about how certainly there have been different types of turns to spirituality that are either used to promote fascism actively, or on the flip side, used by people who would otherwise be radical to kind of like as a form of escapism almost. I guess I just want to ask about kind of a third form, which is something that I've been engaging with a lot lately, which is liberation theology, which has, I feel like, played important roles in various radical social movements throughout history. I think, to quote just two, we can point to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference of the 1960s, and the role of liberation theology in the revolution in Nicaragua. So I guess what I get wary of people on the left dismissing religion too quickly as a possible. Okay, this is turning really long. I'm so sorry. But I guess for me, religion is one of the last standing sites for many people of community and of direct engagement, and can take on forms that actually encourage people to see their collective power. And I'm wondering if any of you have any insights towards where liberation theological movements might exist or might stand within a framework of a larger movement today.
Thank you, Max. I don't see anyone else on Stack, so maybe we'll just start with that question. Sal, if you want to take it first, and then any of the other panelists who want to jump in, and then anyone else who would like to jump on Stack. I'm seeing a lot of good exchanges in the chat, which is awesome. But if you want to sort of broaden that to a voice-based discussion, that'd be great.
Sure. Okay. Thank you, Max. Thanks, Katie. It is a great question. I didn't finish my point now. I remember about Freud, what he did. I mean, he makes, and for a while, I mean, until, I'm sure you know, Max, you have this point that Freud made almost as common knowledge among the left when Marxism was still not dead. And what point I mean? The point that for Freud, the relationship between the invention of God and the father figure and the psychological position and task and role of the father figure is immediate. So God is just that replacement for the father figure. So I mean, whether we call that pathological or not, the origins of the religion and the invention of God, pathological or not, that's something else. We could leave that out, especially because, I mean, and here's the problem where I think I would agree with Laura. Freud had problems, and also one of those problems, he was still, despite all this, he was quite conservative, even in terms of this theory, for example, and conservative in the sense that he still thought that we need, you know, some form of that, you know, and later, of course, you know, you have his students all grants that are more radical. I mean, I know it is problematic to mention Reich, but actually Reich is very interesting, the points he makes about psychoanalysis and the father figure, and the problem he ties back right to 1905, when Lenin is very shocked what happened when during that revolution the soldiers take over the officers, but then they let them go, and he has a wonderful explanation of that. And remember, again, William Reich is the person who, again, one of the refugees from Germany, he's the person who said that the question is not why people go on strike and whatever and steal, but why don't they, or what is missing? And of course, he ties all that back, like many others in that era and that school, especially Freudian Marxists, who you know, fill this, you know, this gap in the theories of fascism, authoritarianism, and whatnot. Okay, back to your question, though. I mean, okay, maybe you would think this is too simplistic, but if we want a liberation movement, why not just go all the way and be, and I know this might sound traditional, but again, to me, the Frankfurt School position is still valid. Just be faithful to the Enlightenment, the healthy part of the Enlightenment principles. I mean, because I agree with you. Of course, there are these kinds of movements. And I guess, you know, the current Pope, if I'm not mistaken, was very close, right, to the liberation theology and whatnot. But then there is always a limit for that. If you go back to the early 1900s, the active socialists in Russia, a lot of them are Christians. And the early Bolsheviks were smart enough not to turn them away because of that. Later, when Lenin is in London, and you know, for a while Trotsky joins them and so on, there they see the same issue, and Lenin makes some points about that, about these Christians in the church and so on, and he sees them as, you know, potential future comrades and so on. But again, there will always be that gap, if nothing else, in terms of, okay, a whole bunch of other problems like patriarchy. Because as long as you have the father figure, sure, you could be progressive in one sense, but what will happen a month from now, 2 months from now, and so on and so forth, when we take power, let's say, and so on and so forth. But here's one last point I want to make. There's an Iraqi writer called Kanan Makia, and he made a fascinating point. I always needed this theorized shortly so I can use, because there's so much problem with this, you know, commodification and fetishization of identities and cultures and whatnot. He says the following in one of his books: oppression is not equality, but it's a condition. And the great thing about this line is that I could be oppressed in one sense. Say I'm in the United States, I'm not white, and so on. I could be oppressed in that one sense. But as a man, it immediately changed. Now, I know there's a lot of work that is done on that. But the usefulness of this view is that it keeps politics alive. So if I put it in my words, and I'm working on that now, is that what matters is what you make out of your identity, not your identity per se. And as we know, a lot of people on the right, exploit that kind of culturalism that, okay, this is what a black person said, so how about that? And that's our fault. That's the fault of internalizing neoliberalist culturalism and so on. Okay, what is the relationship between this and what I was saying? The relationship is that we must eventually go back to actual rational, good rational arguments. Our critique, I remember, I'm sure you know, Max, my sense from your question, that the first generation Frankfurt School, like Horkheimer, Max Horkheimer, was very critical of all this pragmatism and utilitarianism and positivism and so on. And he had the aggressive attacks against Dewey, who would critique Dewey at that time. But actually, it's powerful critique. And that's exactly his point, that you are quantifying everything. But these people stayed faithful to what is healthy, let's put it that way, simplistic, what is healthy in the Enlightenment project. So I would say, yeah, to put it very short, I would say, of course, I would recognize those liberation theology movements, but I would definitely say we must move beyond them because oppression is complex and multi-sided, and it changes and it needs good rational grounds, good philosophy.
Thanks, Sal.
Asked me to hop in, but I didn't know if I was
So Haya, you had said you wanted to hop in specifically on Peter's remarks about direct democracy as a set of tools that must be complemented by specific content. So welcome back, and yeah.
Hi, Peter. Nice to see you. So I've been listening for the last half hour. Sorry, I missed the first part. Missed almost all of it. I wanted to just sort of add to what Peter said, and I wanted to sort of, for people who were in my class yesterday, what I was trying to talk about is the difference between a necessary set of conditions and a sufficient condition. In how, for instance, you need to have fire and a tea kettle and water to boil water. But if you don't have the three happening at the same time in a specific way, you're not going to have boiled water. You could just have, a teapot with water in it. So direct democracy has to have, when I was talking about those ethical principles, if you remember the star that I came up with, the 5 sort of principles, if you don't have a charter with a set of ethical general principles that are explicit and enduring, and that can be particularized out to form political policy, and the content of your direct democracy, the policies that you're going to be making policies about have no meaning whatsoever. So direct democracy has the best chance of being successful when we have a common charter or constitution that we share in our city, town, village, our municipality, and that we share on a confederation-wide basis, so that if a group decided to try to join the confederation and in their set of principles, they don't have non-hierarchy or anti-authoritarianism, etc. If they don't have that in there, if they don't have a moral economy versus capitalist economy, if they don't have social justice, if they don't have that gestalt of rational, transparent, ethical principles, then they don't join the confederation. It's as simple as that. And that is not a hierarchical thing. It's simply through voluntarism, we create a confederation of municipalities that agree on the same general set of ethical principles that are general enough to be democratic, not so specific where you're getting to things that address one community and how they apply this principle as opposed to another community, not too particular as to be undemocratic, but general enough that we retain, remember, from the general to the specific, the general to the particular, that we retain the general principles, say, of non-hierarchy or or moral economy or social justice and equality. We retain that in the content of every policy that we make, and that we're accountable to those. And that's, Bookchin was very clear that yes, the structure of direct democracy is a necessary condition, but it does not become a sufficient condition until we have that content. It's always in danger of changing. Our principles are only as stable as are the people who hold them. So that's, and we have to be able to make those institutions, we talked about institutions, outlast the people who create that charter and that charter, constitution, that set of principles, that it has to be stable enough to endure beyond the people who created it originally. It can be, you know, changed in some way, but that can't be changed dramatically to veer away from those core values and principles that are ethically grounded, such as non-hierarchy, etc. So it's direct democracy plus the ethical principles that create a charter for a constitution.
Thanks, Haya. I am trying to comb the chat. I don't immediately see anyone else on Stack, so if people would like to post in the chat if you're interested in commenting, that would be great. Otherwise, I think I don't know if we were planning to move to breakouts. We have like 10 minutes, so maybe not. No, okay.
No, not in the first session. Hi, you can join us. I hope you're feeling okay.
Yeah, I'm so bummed because I was going to be part of this panel, and I wanted to have the idea for this panel because I feel like we're living in this moment of post-truth that is so insane. So maybe, could I make one comment about that? Like, I'm watching, you know, I've been watching over the weekend Trump's rally and the amount of lying that goes on, and some people can find that to be funny. I'm sure, I can assume we don't find it funny. He lies on purpose. It is a strategy. The strategy is to normalize truth as a relative, measurable thing. And he's not the first person who wants to be an authoritarian dictator who wants to completely relativize truth and shred it. If you read 1984, that was farcical. Trump actually is farcical in many ways, in the ways that he completely tramples truth. And, you know, with Kellyanne Conway in the first year coming out with alternate facts, and that should give us cause for concern that he's, you know, saying now that Antifa people prevented protests, his rally supporters from going to his rally, rather than people maybe had common sense and decided to sit that one out during a pandemic, or maybe they simply didn't want to go. We'll never know. But the fact that this Trumpian moment is such a consistent daily assault on people's normal received expectations of hearing some degree of truth coming out of their leaders, central electorate officials, you know, they all lied, you know, since the beginning, but everybody will agree that he lies, you know, every day, all day, whereas, you know, I think people look at the number of lies in a day and comparing Clinton and the Bushes and Obama, and he's off the charts. And again, I don't believe it's just a personality disorder. I don't think it's just having dementia. I believe it's a strategy. I believe his whole administration lies and distorts. And so there's the lying, there's the complete discreditation of the media, which is essential to any democracy, having freedom of speech and having a shared reality of what counts for fact matters. Fact checking matters to any democracy, so that people can't just come out and say, I feel that Black people are violent and need to be chokeholded. I mean, that can't just be an alternate fact. There has to be some kind of set of fact checking that, you know, the New York Times is trying to do, and I'm not a fan of the Times as a radical institution, but it's the lying and the constant distortion of facts and his complete annihilation of the credibility of any media that is not Fox News, which is a propaganda station, I'm sure you all know, and Breitbart and all the creepy, truly fascistic organizations that put out news garbage. It's the criminalization of the media. It's the criminalization of what protesters are doing and what they're saying. And that is he's brought us into kind of a post-truth disorder that is so dangerous to anybody who wants to have a protest or an uprising or create a new movement. And it's dangerous to this crumbling, eroding democratic experiment that we've been part of. My grandparents got here whenever they got here. I'm second generation. This 250-year-old horrifying, with blood on its hands, experiment of racism, of democracy, even that is at peril with a post-truth disorder. And so I feel like a lot of Bookchin's writings about the need for clear, transparent, recallable, accountable reason could not be more relevant. I didn't think, when I was reading The Eclipse of Reason with Bookchin in the 80s in a study group, we took, I don't know, months to read this book by Horkheimer. That was one of the most beautiful books I've ever read in my life. I never believed when I was reading this that I would live under a regime that was so 1984ian, that was so Nazi-like, that twisted truth and information like balloons are twisted by street performers. And I find it terrifying. And that was why I wanted to have this panel and talk about, while revisiting questions about objectivity, like, does it matter that if you have a feeling or something you can anchor in something greater than your own opinion? Yeah, it does. Because Trump has feelings all the time. He just has a gut feeling, and people like that he talks from his gut. And his gut tells him a lot of really ugly things. And his untruth is literally dangerous to the movement that's trying to gain steam on the streets. Still, it's a month going, and he's dangerous to anybody trying to resist this order. He will lie about the elections.
So we've got about 5 minutes left. We should try to get some questions in. And I'm happy to go a little bit over. If folks have to bounce exactly at, because where you are in 5 minutes, the next session will start, actually, let me double check. I think it's 2:30, but could be wrong. Does anyone have that? The next session, sorry. Actually, it's not at 1:30 like it has been the last 2 days. It's at 2 o'clock Eastern. So it's a guest lecture by Hillary Moore on the racist climate politics of the right. I shared a link to her new book. It's very much in line with the theme of this talk, and that'll be 2 hours instead of 2.5. And then we have, be sure not to forget that tonight from 6 to 8, we have Feminism and Ecological Struggles, a lecture by Silvia Federici, which is gonna be really exciting. So if you have to check out, be sure to check back in. Okay, back to the discussion.
Yeah, Claire, did you want to chime in? I don't think we've heard from you yet. Claire, were you trying to be on stack? Yeah, go ahead.
I wasn't really trying to be on stack. I was responding to a comment from Laura, but maybe just about like whether Trump is perceived to be a fascist, or whether, more people just see him as demented and a lunatic and dismiss the fascism. So I don't know, this is where I'm not sure. As you know, I'm in Vancouver, so the media I see, there are a lot of people, calling Trump out as playing, following the fascist playbook. But then there was some comment sort of saying, well, it's not really taking hold as a narrative in the States. So maybe that's something could just get some clarification or stats on, but yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Did anyone want?
Peter, would you answer that, please? poor Peter, I call him, saying, help, explain this to me.
You're muted.
Is it appropriate for me to? My answer is different from what a lot of folks have been saying in the chat, from part of what Haya's been saying. But I think if we go back to something that Sal said 2 hours ago now, I don't think we should get sidetracked on the question of who is or who is not a fascist.
I agree.
Everything that Donald Trump does and stands for is despicable for a million possible reasons, regardless of the labels that we might or might not apply to him. That, to my mind, is the more important thing. But since we've raised it, and for what it's worth, part of the reason for this is that I'm a historian of fascism, and I pay very close attention to those definitional debates. I don't have a strong view one way or the other in the larger definitional debates, but I do have, in my own work, I have to pay attention to who does and who doesn't fall into the categories that structure my own research. And from that point of view, I don't think Trump rises to the level of, he doesn't fit the profile of a fascist, for better or worse. That doesn't let him off the hook, because he's working in a system where fascism so far has been relatively marginal. If he wants to be a successful politician, it's in his interest to follow some of his other instincts. That man has incredible political instincts. I don't know about the shrewdness part. I'm not sold on that, but his immediate responses to things are remarkably well honed. You can tell that he got his rise in reality television. That's what brought out the strengths in his persona. To my mind, a fascist is someone who comes in with much more of a program, much more of a set of ideas, much more of a set of aims and ambitions and goals that they are going to try to steer their way toward. And thankfully, I haven't seen much of that the last 4 years. Instead, we have this cacophony of people surrounding him, some of them going this way, some of them going that way, some of them going in and out and getting fired and writing tell-all memoirs, and it's chaos. People like Mussolini and Hitler and the other fascist leaders who never quite made it up to that level of notoriety, but were still very important in their day, I think they operated on a really different fashion. What worries me is that when people like Mussolini and Hitler came to power, they didn't just come out of nowhere, especially in Hitler's case. Hitler was preceded by 3 different chancellors, which is what you call the head of the government in Germany back then and now. 3 different chancellors who were on the right, who tried to govern in an authoritarian way, tried to sideline the parliament entirely, the Reichstag, tried to do all these things. They failed, but in essence, they unknowingly, unwittingly, and not wanting to, they set the stage for someone like Hitler to come in. My worry is that Trump may have, so to speak, set the stage. That is something we're going to have to be doing battle over for the next 4 years, 10 years, 50 years. So if we want to fit Trump into the historical narrative around classical fascism, I would say, this is an unsettling thought, I would say compare him to Germany in 1930, in 1931, in 1932, not to Germany in 1933, which is when Hitler actually comes to power. That's my best job as a response to that question.
Thank you, Peter. We are right at the top of the hour, so I'm wondering if we may want to call it there, as otherwise I think we could go on for a long time on this topic, and I know there'll be more chance tomorrow to discuss it. So we'll give everyone the 2-hour break and then start again at 2 p.m. today, so different from the weekend sessions, so a little bit longer of a lunch break or dinner break or wherever you are in the world, and then come back at 2 p.m. for, what is that panel again, Blair? Or what is that session?
It's Hillary Moore on the racist climate politics of the right. I shared a link to her very new book up above, so it'll really build nicely on these themes. She's a longtime ISC affiliate, has written on the intersection of climate politics on one hand and racism on the other. She had another one on the John Brown anti-Klan organizing in the United States in the past.
Sweet. Thank you. All right, yeah, that should be fascinating. So see you all at 2 Eastern or in 2 hours from wherever you are.
Thanks, Peter, Sal,
Thank you all.
and everyone else for a great conversation. Nice to see you all, and yeah, continue the conversation later. we'll also pick up tomorrow in the class on capitalism, as Peter mentioned.